Ladies and gentlemen, this is Luke Johnson and Robert Schut. Welcome back to our 8th installment of our seminar on Soren Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments. Bob will be illuminating most of the discourse for us today, unless we get to the fourth section of chapter 4, the apprehension of the past, which I will take over. But we discussed and huddled a little bit before we got on air here. The amount of material that Bob has to cover today might prevent us to getting that point. We'll do that in installment 9 if need be. So without further ado, I'll let Bob take control.
Okay, well, hello everybody. It's been a week since we've discussed this topic, so I'm sure that I think a review is probably the best place to begin. So we'll review what we covered last week, and then we can take it from there. What we talked about last week was that it was necessary for God to become a man in order to love man at the same level as man. And it kind of goes back to the story that Kierkegaard gave us, or Climacus gave us, about the king and the maiden, that they were at unequal levels of status, so they really couldn't fulfill their love. So that was one of the issues that we discussed, that it would be necessary for God somehow to become a man in order to fully love man and to allow man to fully love him. Without the divine, we would have no paradox or moment, for the teacher would be accidental. So one of the things that Kierkegaard is trying to do throughout this whole thing is to preserve the idea of the paradox rather than to solve it. So he's saying if we don't have a paradox or a moment, that special moment, then the teacher would be accidental, meaning he could just be substituted with anyone else. There was no importance on the teacher per se. And the paradox would become something that we could understand, and therefore it would place us at the center. And this is one of the things that I just kind of realized when I was going over the review, Luke, is that the paradox has to remain a paradox, an unsolvable paradox. If it becomes something solvable, then the issue is man's knowledge goes right back into the center again. And then he loses this barrier where he requires faith. He doesn't need faith if he can solve the paradox. So the paradox actually preserves the integrity of our faith. The next issue is he would have to be divine in order to give man the condition by his presence. The idea of how does he, and I guess we kind of get into, I'm getting a little bit earlier on this, ahead of myself, but the condition, the way we get the condition, we talked about what it was, and the condition was faith. But how do we get faith? Eventually, Kierkegaard is going to tell us it's the very presence of God, or the very presence of the teacher, that gives us this faith. The importance lies upon the teacher and not upon the teaching, regardless of how wonderful the teaching might be. So no matter how eloquent the teacher might be, and his teaching rather is, no matter how it might answer all our theological questions and all our psychological questions, it's not the most important thing as far as Kierkegaard's concerned. What the most important thing is the teacher here, and we don't want to lose track of that. I think we've lost track of that. We're beginning to lose track of that in our society today when it comes to our Christianity. Christ as a person is beginning to drift away from the theological center of things. And he's being pushed out a little bit more than I'm comfortable with anyway. And the teaching is still there, but the teacher has kind of lost his central position at this. He's beginning to be pushed out, I should say it that way.
Well, why do you think that is, Bob? I think we could probably connect that back to some of the issues that we talked about already. I mean, there's something about certain aspects of the teaching of Jesus Christ that sit well with us, mm-hmm. but the being that is Jesus Christ does not. Do you get what I'm hitting at here? The nature
Absolutely.
of offense. Yeah. And maybe that kind of explains what's going on in contemporary culture to some extent. Like, it seems like to me that, and I've struggled my entire life to find, say, a church home. And I guess in a lot of ways, I kind of consider you my minister in some way, if you'll take that title, is that it's very hard to have real theology spoken in the pulpit, because the issue is to try to get as many people to show up. And emphasizing Jesus Christ, or the paradox, is incredibly offensive. It's not a good business model.
Absolutely right. And I think you pretty much answered your own question. That's at the basis of it, is that the business model for a church is to get as many people in as you can. And that's not entirely a bad thing. It's just that at what price are you willing to pay in order to have that happen? I mean, if you can get legitimate converts into your church, by all means, do it. But unfortunately, I tend to see what's happening is the man Christ, the being Christ, as we could call him, the teacher, what Climacus calls him, is being negotiated away, and he's not as important because of that offense, mostly the offense of the resurrection. That offends most people. They say, hey, I can believe in all the teachings of Jesus. He was a wonderful guy. You know, he said a lot of beautiful words, and I can believe all that stuff. But you're asking me to believe in that he was the Son of God and that there was a resurrection involved. So that offends me. That offends my intellect. Yeah, my intellect says no. I can't believe, because that would be to humiliate yourself. And
yeah, and it would require acknowledging an individual above yourself, right? Which would go against a lot of the egalitarian currents that we have in our culture. Similarly, it would disrupt this Andrew Lloyd Webber interpretation of Jesus Christ as just a really cool dude that played hacky sack out in the desert. Right?
Yeah, it is. And I see that becoming
was it Andrew Lloyd Webber who did Jesus Christ Superstar?
That sounds familiar. That rings a bell. Yeah. But it might be one of his really early shows. But yeah, and it's happening because, one of the things that's driving it is the postmodern idea of the author is no longer important. And the only thing that's important is the reader. And it's kind of focusing more on that situation. I am the most important thing here, not the author, not the writer, not the teacher. And so we've really drifted away from the Christ because of that. That's, to me, at least it may not have been the driving force, but it seems to be the people that I discuss this with, they seem to cling to that idea. It may not, I'm not going to blame postmodernism, but I'm going to say that people with this idea tend to cling to postmodernism to prove their point. Okay, so it makes it a little less accusative. But anyway, that kind of is where we're at today. So this is why this is important. This whole thing with Kierkegaard, this whole Fragments is so important, because he's trying to gain that trust in the teacher back again. So this is a time that this needs to be heard, definitely, again.
Well, it seems like we perpetually forget it. It seems like that there always needs to be a Martin Luther or a Kierkegaard, or I don't know, if we take ourselves very seriously, I mean, Bob's and Luke's.
Well, the more people hear it, and I think the more people realize that you don't have to be an idiot to be a Christian. I mean, you're a very intellectual guy. I can speak for you. And there's I've read some books that these guys are way over my head, and they believe in Christ and they believe in the resurrection. So it's not really just an intellectual issue. There's plenty of very smart people out there who believe. It's just they're not getting as much publicity.
Well, you know what I would say is that it's almost that the passion of faith is I think I would say this. I would say being an intellectual person makes the acceptance of faith harder, and it makes sort of the struggle against it harder. It makes life itself harder because you're constantly fixated with it, and you've deified reason. But I would sort of anticipate that if one could sort of move beyond reason to something that's not irrational but super rational, that the pleasure of faith, for me, I can only speak for myself, but if I were to do any sort of comparison, might be in a way qualitatively better than those who just sort of have the faith of a child, who just kind of were reborn in the womb, never really had to abandon their faith and come back to it and approach it on intellectual grounds. Maybe all the wandering, maybe all the struggle ultimately meant for something more meaningful. I don't know. So I guess maybe that what I would say is that the Christian faith might reward the intellectual, not punish.
Oh yeah, eventually, hopefully that will happen. I don't doubt that. It's just that he has to go around about in order to get there and go through a whole lot more of wilderness before he comes back. Hopefully he will come back again. I have some friends that have drifted away in that way, and I hope they do come back again, because they'll probably be much better when they come back, having been through it. And one of the biggest issues here in our review is that he's trying to tell us that it's not the historical moment that adds anything to the condition of faith. As a matter of fact, it might even detract from it. So in our reasoning, we might have thought that the disciples really had the edge, they had the advantage. Maybe, not just the 12, but the 1,000 of disciples that followed the teacher or the Christ when he was on earth, that they have some kind of an advantage. And Kierkegaard says no. And he's going to go into a great detail, a great elaboration that's very difficult for us to explain as we get deeper into this in the next part of our segment here. But he's going to show that the historical moment really doesn't add anything. So being an eyewitness, being a contemporary of Christ really doesn't change things dramatically. The moment has to do with the eternal and not the temporal. And that's, again, another issue that we've kind of discussed here up to this point. The moment of confrontation, when we realize our error, brings us into an awareness of the eternal rather than being caught up in the temporal. The more we're in the temporal, the more we are still in that error. We're still in that self-deception. It's not understanding the paradox that counts. It's understanding that there is a paradox. And he talked about the eternal historical and the historical eternal coming together. So one of the issues is it's not our goal as believers to try to solve the paradox of Christ being divine or how God could become a man. That's a paradoxical situation that does not need a solution. As a matter of fact, if we try to solve it, and if we think we've solved it, what we've done is we've nullified it. We've negated the whole effect of the paradox. The paradox is there to bring us to the condition, which is faith. So if we eliminate the paradox through reasoning, then we eliminate the condition. And now we're certainly stuck back in the Socratic method, where the teacher isn't important anymore. It's not understanding. Oh, I did that one there. Okay, reason wants to solve the paradox, and faith simply wants to believe in it. It's kind of hard to just give into our faith. It's like we've been brought up, raised, and taught that reason really is the superior organ Kierkegaard would probably use. The mind is the superior organ over the heart, over faith. And so that's the one we want to build on. That's the one we want to develop. And somewhere in the process of evolution, faith is being phased out. And pretty soon we're going to become just totally rational people. We won't need faith anymore.
Yeah, right.
That kind of sounds like the plot of some of these modern, these futuristic movies, where we have 1980. Remember that? Of course, we've passed that 20 years ago, more than 30 years ago. Yeah, 1984. But there's still others, and that's kind of where they lead us, where mankind follows after the rational side and becomes totally controlling civilization, except for the rebels, like you and me, Luke. I guess we'll be the
we'll be the resistance.
The resistance movement, right? We'll have our little podcasts in the future. Okay, so that's our review. So, any questions from you, Luke? Did we?
Yep. Think you're good.
Okay. Now we can cultivate some new ground here. There is an advantage for the contemporary. So now he's going to backtrack a little bit. He's going to say, okay, I've been telling you all along there's no advantage for the contemporary. We're all on equal par here. He said, well, maybe I've been a little too hasty. There is an advantage for the contemporary. He gets to see the teacher. He gets to look into his eyes. He has an advantage, but it's more of an aesthetic nature. Okay, he can hear the expression of the voice of Christ teaching, or the teacher. But again, he stops us and says, does this make him a disciple, though? And he says, no, it doesn't. Physical appearance is no reason to follow him. It could be a disadvantage. People might tend to believe the teacher if he looked more like Tom Cruise than the Buddha. It's just human nature. So it's part of our weakness that it could become a negative. It could become a deficit, being a contemporary. It might make us envious of the contemporary, but it does not make the contemporary a disciple, for the conception of God rises above the physical appearance of the teacher. Some of us get caught up, and even in churches, I think we see this kind of on maybe a miniature level in churches. You have a real handsome pastor who's just very eloquent in his speech. He has a booming voice like Charlton Heston. And people say, well, I want to believe. I want to become a member of this church. But are they really becoming disciples of Christ? So we have a problem of the contemporary today. If he's so caught up in the pastor, then he's no better than the contemporary of the historical contemporary, I guess I could call him that, where the appearance of the teacher influenced him a little too much.
Yeah.
Being able to see the teacher may even confuse the learner, for it redirects the focus onto the temporal again.
Right. And it makes the faith totally predicated with one's infatuation with that particular teacher. So if that teacher were to experience a fall from grace, then one would lose their faith rather easily.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point.
Which happens so frequently with these awe-inspiring orators from the pulpit, right? I mean, it's a little too good to be true, right? And then you find out that they're living in mansions or
right.
I mean, not that it's impossible and that we should be, skeptical of everyone, but sometimes things are a little too good to be true.
Televangelists have probably, made this more real than any place, where their appearance and their showmanship has really sold Christianity, and they've got millions of believers just sending money in to help them. And are they really disciples? Well, they're disciples, but maybe not of Christ. They're probably disciples of the televangelist. And that's where we've got to be careful. Got to make sure we keep the teacher in his proper place.
It's probably a good idea to not send them money if they're going to give you a little bottle of holy water. No, that's just kind of my general principle with anyone who's preaching on TV.
Well, it's not even TV, Luke, because I was doing a little research for my Bible study, and the internet is filled with people selling holy water. Just search on it, and you'll find people.
Oh my God!
You should see them. I mean, it's incredible. Yeah, they're selling holy water over the internet. It's for me. It's kind of laughable, but it's also it makes me so sad to see it. But it's just they've caught up with modern times now.
Kierkegaard had to deal with the same issues. I mean, if you look at the moment, I don't know how familiar you are with that. And I'm sure you know Kierkegaard's general biography and his relationship with the Lutheran Church in the 19th century. He was very concerned with the selling of baptismal certificates and things like that. He thought that they smacked of the indulgences that the papacy was issuing that Martin Luther responded against. So, I mean, it seems like this stuff just keeps creeping back into Christianity. It's like you got to take like the fundamental message of existentialist Christianity wherever you go and just like hack away at this overgrown jungle that takes over the monument or this beautiful thing,
what a beautiful metaphor. That's a great picture, because that's really what's happening. And sometimes it's like a losing battle, Luke. I mean, I don't really feel like I'm making a whole lot of gains when I look around the world. My little contribution is like just a little drop. I mean, it's insignificant.
But if you were to do that, then you're trusting on the temporal. You're trusting on the aesthetic, right? Like then you're caught up in the aesthetic too. If you're like, well, I can't really see the quantitative difference that I'm making, then you too would be sort of beholden to that. All we can really do is do it. I mean, I'm not trying to reprimand you on it, but I mean, I guess
No, you're absolutely right.
We've got to get out of those aesthetic categories.
Yeah, it's easy to fall into the sense of failure if you judge yourself based upon that. But we don't have time to do that. I don't have time to do that. I mean, I'm tempted by it. Occasionally, it does tempt me to say, Bob, you're failing. You're just not making any progress here. But I put that behind me. I do. I'm not saying it isn't there, but I'm able to still put that behind me and say, Bob, you don't have time to feel sorry for yourself. Get out there and do what you're supposed to do.
I really doubt that Kierkegaard understood his significance based on the time that he lived, right? Like, yeah. I mean, could he have ever imagined that he would become this important, right? I mean, he wasn't even translated within his lifetime. He wasn't even translated into English. He didn't even know what the internet was. And here we are. I mean, I don't know. I mean, at this very moment, this transmission will probably receive hundreds, if not thousands of listens over the next couple of weeks. Like, could he have ever anticipated that? So maybe the same thing happens with you.
Well, I with Kierkegaard and reading a little bit more about him and his biographies and stuff, I think he believed that he was specially chosen.
Yes, he did.
I do believe that he thought he was specially chosen by God for a purpose. That's why he didn't marry. That's why he didn't get a job. He just totally devoted himself to writing. So, yeah, I don't know if he was expecting. Of course, I'm sure it would have been great if people would have ran out and bought all his books as soon as they came out and he became a best-selling author. That didn't quite happen, but I think he knew he was special. Right. So.
Oh yeah.
Now, one of the issues also here is that if we assume that the teacher dies, what will the contemporary learner do? Well, one of the things he might save some artifacts of the teacher. Save his sandals, save his pieces of his robe, make a drawing of him, a sketch of him, just do something of him. And maybe holy relics fall under this category of people who are caught up in the contemporary. We want something we can see and touch that brings us back to we can almost be contemporaries if we have a piece of the cross, you know.
Oh yeah.
And
I've ever since I was a kid, I was always fascinated by the Shroud of Turin.
yeah.
Yeah, that was the. I mean, I'm not really into religious relics, but that one seemed pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, and it still is an interesting relic. But I think we have to ask ourselves where that fits in our faith. You know, what happens if it turns out to be real? What happens if it turns out to be a fake? Like you said before, is our faith predicated on the relics? And that's a danger there. But that makes us more of a contemporary disciple, not a true disciple, but one that's built on the contemporary, on the temporal issues.
Yeah.
As long as I have a relic, then I can believe. But if I don't have a relic, I really can't believe.
And Bob, this might be a little bit of a digression, but because I respect your opinion on this so much, and I imagine other people would want to hear it too, do you mind if I ask it?
Yeah, go ahead.
So it seems like a lot of what our Christian faith is predicated upon is the absence of a relic, specifically the absence of Christ's body. And I don't know if you've seen like more recently that like there's been like kind of a reopening of what they think may be Christ's tomb or whatever. It was in the news last week. It's gone now, just kind of how the news cycle goes. For a long time, I heard people say that, you know, if Christ's body was ever found, if it ever could be identified, that the entire Christian faith would come crashing down because it would refute the story of the resurrection. Do you think that's true? Have you ever thought about that issue? Because I guess it really is a question of how you imagine the resurrection, because it doesn't seem obvious to me that it was a completely physical resurrection, given the fact that Jesus was able to change forms or at least appear differently to people. I don't know. Would it matter to you if Christ's body was found? If that relic?
I think you're absolutely right that Christianity is based on what they call the empty tomb.
Right.
The empty tomb idea, that Christ did physically resurrect. I would say I'm with Paul on this one. I'll probably have to paraphrase him on this, but he said that if the resurrection was not true, then we are the biggest fools in the world. And I would just have to say that would be where I would fit. I mean, I'm sticking my neck out based upon the idea that Christ was resurrected. If it's proven to be wrong, well, then I'm a fool. But that's where I would stand. I wouldn't change my mind.
I don't know if I would stop. I don't know if I would stop being a Christian if Christ's body was found. I would just think, well, maybe my conception of resurrection was wrong.
Yeah, we might re-question ourselves, but I don't think so. I think throughout everything that the New Testament spoke, that our faith is really based on, our faith as being a disciple is based upon the resurrection in the empty tomb. If they discovered it, I would be crushed, because that's who I am now. You know, it's not just what I believe. It's not just what I do in my spare time on Sundays. It's who I am now, you know, and it's like finding out, it's finding out even more so than you were adopted and not knowing it. You know, it's just finding something out about yourself that is just horrifying. You know, that I wouldn't have words. I don't know how to phrase it, because I would be totally crushed if I found that out. Yeah, and I would, like Paul said, that everything he believed in was based upon that. And same thing with me at this point in my life. Not always. It hasn't always been that way, but it is now.
Well, I'm glad you said. I think we should probably move on, because that's a whole subject in and of itself. But I think if we do get the apprehension of past today, we probably won't. But when we do in the next installment, talking about the testimonies of those contemporaries and what they mean to us, who are the historical successors, and how we're to interpret the words of Paul and others. But why don't you go ahead and proceed with what you have planned?
Okay. And then he says, he cannot form a conception of God based upon the physical appearance of the teacher. So what the teacher looks like or his eloquence, his ability to speak, has nothing to do with the concept of God that we form based upon the teacher. So in other words, that kind of speaks negatively about the contemporary disciple. There's nothing in Christ that he could have shown to them at that time that they would have been able to say, oh, I see, you're God incarnate. So it's that issue here, I think, that Kierkegaard is trying to tell us. How then does the contemporary become a disciple? So after we've been showing that the contemporary does not have an advantage, then how does he become a disciple? Is it any different than the way we become a disciple? So he too must set aside the reasonable explanation of the paradox so that he can receive the condition. So he himself, believing that, let's say, the teacher is claiming to be, or somehow it's coming out that he is divine, he is God incarnate. How does he explain that? Well, he doesn't have any advantage because he still has to allow that paradox to become the condition. In other words, he has to allow that idea to create faith in him. If he doesn't let that paradox create faith in him and he tries to solve it, then he's exactly in the same boat as a person today who tries to solve the paradox and refuses to allow it to develop faith. It's this condition, which is faith, that allows us to transcend reason, which was made for the temporal and not for the eternal. Reasoning is great, right? I mean, we all have reason, and Kierkegaard isn't saying we should be unreasonable. So there's a difference here. You know, people, in arguing, people might say, oh, so you're claiming, you know, an idiot has a better chance of being a believer than an intellectual. No. There's reason has its place. It's given to us for the sake of the temporal world. But as he'll show, as he'll develop, faith is given to us for the purpose of the eternal world. Okay? So they're two separate talents that we have. And we should use reasoning to be reasonable when we need to be reasonable and use it for those purposes, using the right tool for the right thing. But we also have to develop our faith for the eternal things, which we haven't been doing as a world culture. We haven't really been developing a faith anymore. At least I shouldn't say the world. I've not been not a world traveler, but in the people that I've met in my world, I could say it that way, I haven't seen faith being developed. I've seen reasoning being developed all the more. So.
Well, there was a question I wanted to ask you. You introduced this idea of how the nature of the paradox makes it so that one doesn't necessarily need to be, it doesn't really matter if one's an intellectual or an idiot. That paradox sort of provides a limit that preserves the organ of faith.
Yeah.
You know, when you think about that to the extremes, I don't know if you have any feelings about this. Like, at what point does a person, at what point might they not have the ability to comprehend the paradox and the limit to their own thinking? I think maybe children can do it. Like, I think maybe as a small child, I understood the absolute insanity of a God dying on a cross. But I don't know. I mean, do you think there are some people that can't really apprehend that paradox and make room for faith?
Well,
like the severe, I guess how do you view perhaps the severely handicapped or something like that?
Oh, if you're speaking on that end of the spectrum, God, I'm not going to try to squirm out of it by saying, well, God will take care of that. But I think that they really do grasp the paradox.
You think so?
Perhaps they grasp it better than we do, because they're not distracted by reasoning. I think they see God, and when Jesus said, he said, blessed are the little children. I think that because their angel always beholds the face of God. I think he's kind of saying the same thing there, the simplicity, that they're not distracted by reasoning. So they'll probably enter the kingdom before the Pharisees, who had the intellect and the reasoning. So, yeah, I see it that way. But to answer your question, on the other end of the spectrum, what about the super intellectual people? We're going to actually get into that, where Kierkegaard takes us back to the ancient Greek skeptics and how they dealt with it. So I don't want to give that. I'm so tempted to give it away now, but I'm not going to. Yeah.
Well, let's just bracket it for now.
Okay. Yeah. We'll kind of hold off on that. So it's this conditioned faith that allows us to transcend reason, which was made for the temporal, not the eternal. Okay. Reason is the means to get us beyond the paradox. It's faith that achieves this. So again, we want to make sure that we use reasoning for the right situations, and we use faith for the right situations. And faith should not denigrate reasoning, but reasoning should not denigrate faith. See, I mean, we shouldn't, say, well, you're too intellectual, you don't get it. It's not one of those pointing finger situations. It's a question of which is better. Well, they're two different things used for two different purposes. There's nothing wrong with reasoning, and there's nothing wrong with faith. We've just got to use them for the things at which they were designed. And this was one of the things that kind of was a good point that I like to bring up in conversations with people, and especially people who don't believe in faith. And they say, well, why do you think God gave you faith? Or why do you think man has faith? What's the purpose of faith? Is it a mistake? Is it an evolutionary mistake that's going to somehow get phased out as we become more and more intellectual? I mean, what's the purpose of faith? If it's in our DNA, or if it's in our psyche, aren't we obligated to develop faith in the same way we want to develop reasoning? So why have we just stopped trying to develop faith as though it's some, like you said, some childish thing, and just said, let's just develop reasoning? Because if we project that kind of a society out, we kind of turn into those futuristic shows. Do we really want to live in a society totally rationalized?
Well, what's the concern, right? What kind of society does Kierkegaard think that we'd be entering into? Do you take away eternal consequences? I mean, what if we were to paint the portrait of what that hyper-rational society would look like? How do you understand Kierkegaard's interpretation of it? Something repulsive, is it not?
Oh yeah, as far as putting it, definitely it would be repulsive. Well, it'd be repulsive to me. It would be repulsive to me, and
well, maybe we should.
Other people.
Well, maybe we should bring out that repulsive character to it, and actually maybe, bring it home to people for, what are we actually trying to fight for here?
Well, yeah, when we'd have to look at the ethical side of such a society, the moral side of such a society. Everything would be rational, determining how many years a person should live before we execute them to make room for the new people coming in. And what kind of children should we have? Well, they better be the most intellectual, so if they don't pass an IQ test, we must have to eliminate them too. It would be, a society, at least the way I would view it, a society without the faith in something. It wouldn't have the faith to go beyond the immediate.
The kinder, gentler totalitarianism, right?
Right. Yeah, we're doing everything. Go ahead.
we're gonna phase this group of people out. Maybe not violently, but maybe through one program or another, in order to kind of get everybody the same in some way.
Yeah, don't we see trace of that today?
Well, Bob, we're going down kind of a dangerous corridor here. If we say much else, we might find ourselves on some list somewhere.
We're drinking Kool-Aid in the jungle. Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't want to be doing that. But
no, we love you, Google.
We'll have to be doing our podcast from some basement somewhere, some old fallout shelter built in the 60s.
Yeah, we'll start passing things around on CD or jump drives or something like that.
Yeah. Okay, back to where I was here.
Yes, let's talk more in code.
Okay, so in love, God makes himself equal to the humblest man in order to satisfy love's desire for equality. So again, the teacher becomes man in order to make himself equal. And in order to do that, he has to become the most humblest of man in order to make sure he captures that equality. In love, well, let's see. So there's nothing about the man as the teacher, special teaching to contemporaries, in other words, that gives us the condition. So there's nothing about the teaching itself that gives us the condition. So there's nothing contemporary about him that gives the condition. Nothing special about Jesus. In other words, did he have long hair or a crew cut? Well, if he didn't have if he had a crew cut, I don't want to be a Christian.
That's
right.
I've never imagined Jesus with a crew cut. Hyper masculine military Jesus.
Yeah. And it's that kind of when we go to the extremes, the portrait of Jesus, what would it be if he was a short, bow-legged, stuttering guy with a big nose? Would we believe in him as the Messiah?
Right. I mean, all these portraits that we have of Jesus, he's kind of a hunk. He's kind of a, I mean, as a straight dude, I can look at him and be like, that's a really dreamy Messiah we got there.
Look at the movies. The movies we've got. I mean, they don't just hire somebody off the street. I mean, they got to definitely fit that particular picture.
I don't know if you saw this a couple years ago. Some archaeologists and anthropologists used some whatever evidence they had of Jesus's existence. They used it to kind of create a computer model of what he really looked like.
I did see that.
And he looked. He was not a hunk. Looked based off of that computer rendering, which we'll talk more about this. I mean, that's going to be a fabrication, right? Like what
right.
Do you have the will to believe that this is an accurate rendering of Jesus? It doesn't really seem any more plausible to me than the idealized versions. But if it were to be true, based on this computer rendering, you can go look it up. He kind of it kind of almost looked like a caveman.
Yeah, he did. But, and that kind of stuff is funny. It's fun to play with. But it would be like saying, what does a Jew look like? Let's just form one Jew and then see that would be what a Jew looks like today. Jewish people look so different. There's so many different extremes of what they look like. So to kind of blend in, I don't know.
It would be some sort of racist caricature,
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, it wouldn't. You can't do that. It'd be like asking, "What does a white person look like?"
Yeah,
it would. Yeah, you wouldn't be able to do that.
So it's given by the teacher being the teacher. That's where we get the condition. So the teacher has to it's his being, the teacher. And this gets a little more complicated, but if you can just try to realize it, it's not in when he's teaching. The teaching is only a reflection of who he is, but it isn't, something that we can isolate from his being. So the teaching is good because we have to have the teaching. We have to know, what did he say? What kind of a man was Jesus? So the teaching is important to give us that picture of him. But again, it's trying to give us the being of the teacher. What kind of a person was he? And it goes even beyond that, Luke. It goes to the point of, what did he do as a teacher? And this is something that's the most significant. It's not just what Jesus taught. He was a great teacher, but it's what he did that reveals God's love for man. That sacrificial moment that Jesus gives himself for man is the most important part of his teaching. It's the most important part of his being a teacher. That was really what he was to do.
It is really where Christ's divinity is revealed and is on the cross and the resurrection. Like, if that had never happened, would the contemporary disciples have to believe the claims that this man was the Son of God?
This is a slow process that took place from the moment Jesus was born to actually even before that. The moment that Mary was pregnant, the angel Gabriel made an announcement. He said that you will be found pregnant from the Holy Spirit. And for this reason, he shall be called the Son of God. So it was from that very moment he was developing, not developing into the Son, but he was revealing who he was from that moment on. But the revelation fully took place at the resurrection. That's when everybody knew, now I know he's the Messiah, because it's indisputable now. Prior to that, he was a teacher. Maybe he was a miracle worker, but there were other miracle workers in those days.
Do you think the disciples experienced a shift in their subjective faith before and after the resurrection? Do you think they thought they had faith, but then once they experienced the resurrection, they're like, oh, okay, this is a whole new thing that we're dealing with here?
Absolutely. I think Peter reflects that more than anybody, because Peter did not want to give his life. He didn't want to put himself in jeopardy.
He denied Christ three times, right?
Yeah, he didn't want to put himself in jeopardy because he knew he could lose his life over it. And the other disciples all ran away as well. So yet it wasn't until the resurrection that now they knew, now their faith has come to total fruition. And now they were willing to give their lives for their faith. Prior to that, they just kind of went back to, before the resurrection, they went back to working on boats and stuff. I mean,
that makes a lot of sense, but I can't imagine that's an uncontroversial claim that we just made there. That, I mean, it totally makes sense, but I imagine that there are some people who would say, no, the disciples, may have had that faith all along, but I have no problem with it.
Yeah, well, I'm not really speculating. I'm just kind of quoting Scripture. That's what Scripture, the portrait of Scripture of Peter was just that. I mean,
totally.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm not making something up. It's not just opinion. It's more just reflecting what Scriptures say.
Yeah, I know, and I believe that. I know as we walk through so much biblical stuff, like, there are just so many landmines of controversy. Like, for instance, you talked about develop into the Son of God, but he was from conception, he was the Son of God. I'm sure there are heresies out there where people think he was a man and then he had a special experience and he crossed over into this divine realm. Because I think for many, many years, and you know church history better than I do, trying to understand exactly who Christ was. Was he a moral teacher? Was he the Son of God? Did he become the Son of God in real time? I mean, all I'm really trying to say is there are many perspectives on this, and it took many, many centuries for there to be consensus on these issues. And some of these, like we saw last week with the Arian controversy and trying to understand the Trinity, a lot of these things still persist in schisms of the church today. I wasn't trying to say that we had fabricated anything, but merely that if we dug deeper, I'm sure we could find perspectives that are at odds with one another on a lot of these issues.
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, that is a result of people trying to solve the paradox.
Right.
That's what created all these ideas, is that people trying to solve the paradox. I believe it's called adoptionism, but they believe that Jesus.
Yes.
Jesus
Adoptions.
became the Son of God. That baptism was one of the issues. When he was baptized by John, that's when he became the Son of God. So,
right.
So, you're right on target there. Okay, so God gives us the condition that enables us to have faith. The condition is himself. This is why Christ, the teacher, had to be God, because it was God. It was established by Socrates that God had given man prior to his birth the condition in order to satisfy the Socratic idea. That's why when man was born, he already had the condition. But with Climacus, he says, no, he doesn't have the condition. He has to receive the condition. The condition is faith, and he has to receive it from the teacher, but not as a teaching, but he receives it from the fact the teacher is the object of his faith. So he makes sense. It's just that you have to weave all his ideas together to try to put it together to make sense out of it. The first thing that he learned from this condition is that he was in error. So just kind of a reminder that this condition of faith, the moment we realize our error, the moment we realize our self-deception, is the moment we receive the condition. If we can't get past the idea that we are subject to self-delusion, then we can never get into the realm of faith, because we're always going to think we've got the answer. And that's one of the most important things about self-delusion that we have to continue to remind ourselves of, that we can be wrong. That we can be wrong when it comes to reasoning. Now, I have a little section here. I called it fallacious reasoning. This is kind of like a little bit of Bob's insert here. Many are so proud of their knowledge, but fail to take into consideration the possibility of deception to which they're vulnerable. One of the greatest deceptions is to think that one knows in part. It's the same thing as knowing something fully or perfectly. Science is guilty of this error many times, in that it's easy to believe that the part resembles the whole. This is an error of logic. We have learned that the whole isn't always the sum of its parts. So understanding the part doesn't mean that we're inductively going to understand the whole. This has actually got a name. It's called the fallacy of composition. And examples is no atoms are alive. So things made of atoms are not alive. I mean, it makes reasonable sense.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a fallacy of composition. We know, in fact, it to be wrong, but we could not prove it inductively. Inductively, you can never arrive at life from an atom. See? Another one here, this is probably more fitting. I'm sure you've experienced this one here, Lucas. I said, if someone stands up at a concert, they will see better. It means that if everyone stands up at a concert, they will all see better.
Nope.
It doesn't work. There's just kind of simplistic examples of that fallacy. So faith itself is paradoxical. It's a miracle. So paradox and faith go hand in hand. So I asked myself the question, well, how is faith a paradox? Kierkegaard doesn't really say that or prove that or anything, but because faith appears to be absurd to the reasoning. Faith is paradoxical to the reasoning because faith wants to believe things that the reasoning can't prove. And therefore, the reasoning sees it as paradoxical. Belief in the resurrection, belief in the God-man of Christ, belief that murder somehow can become a holy act, meaning the crucifixion. That somehow the murdering the Messiah is somehow going to save everybody. This is kind of at the foundation of the reason why many Jewish people don't believe. They can't see the Messiah as being one who's murdered. It doesn't make
Right.
sense.
Well, it's especially offensive to think about a God being nailed to the cross, right?
Yes.
This in a way, I think many would take this as evidence to the contrary of Christ's divinity, that he couldn't pull himself down.
Right. But the way I see it now is, what better way for God to pull it off? What better way for God to demand faith over reason?
Well, why don't you elaborate on that? Why do you say? Is it because he experiences such agony and experiences like the full range of pain that humans could experience? Because some people have used that way as because it's not that would have been the only way for Christ to die and be resurrected, but it was an especially gruesome way. But it seems to be more along the lines because it adds to there's a lot of ways that the paradox is offensive, right? Not only that we have to believe that man came into finite form, or that God came into finite form, but that somehow God was completely subject to the laws of nature in that body's form and couldn't, escape it when necessary.
Yeah, it's inconceivable. Inconceivable to reasoning to believe that, especially at that time when the Jews' picture of a Messiah was a man who was going to come riding in on a white charger and drive out the Romans out of the holy city. That was their picture. It's just totally offensive to think of him hanging on a cross. They were
sort of expecting a political conqueror?
Absolutely. Many of them. That's the picture that they had from Isaiah. But that was only half of the picture. That was only half.
I'm just kind of I would love to know, why do you think? Since you are so familiar with Isaiah, is it just Isaiah that prepared many of the Jewish people at that time for a political conqueror, and not this type of Messiah? How go haywire there?
Oh, I think it was in Psalms. It was in Jeremiah too, in Daniel. I think there was a lot of prophetical writings that portrayed the Messiah as being victorious. But what the failure to see was that the victory, these were metaphors. The victory would be over conquesting over sin, not over rulers of the world, rulers of the land. So the conquests would be internally conquests, conquests of faith through the Messiah.
Yeah, a conquest over death itself, which is a much more profound and meaningful form of conquest than just being freed, political liberation.
Well, yeah,
right?
Like you said, conquest over death, conquest over error, conquest over sin. There's so many conquests that our Messiah was victorious over. And that just wasn't, they didn't see it as the metaphor. They saw the metaphor as the reality rather than as having a higher meaning.
Would you say that was the mainline perspective of most Jews at that time, or what number of people? I don't know. It's probably pointless to even sort of speculate because we don't have the data on this or whatever. But how many people were willing to reconfigure the political conqueror and embrace this new conception of the Messiah as a spiritual conqueror? Was it just this small band of disciples that eventually grew, or was there more of a dramatic shift amongst the Jewish population around the time of Christ's resurrection?
Well, it certainly wasn't 50-50. There was a segment of the population. They had a pretty good-sized church in Jerusalem under James and John and even Peter that contained members of the Sanhedrin and members of the priesthood that were Christians at that time under that church. So there was a segment of the population who did realize it. but it wasn't the majority by any chance. And it certainly wasn't the most powerful portion of the society either.
So it was more than 12. There might have been.
Yeah. Thousands.
What, thousands?
They spoke in numbers like thousands. So yeah, there was thousands of people who believe. I mean, I can't validate what kind of Christianity that they had, but I can just say that they were considered to be members of the church, considered to be believers. Yeah.
So I'm sorry I'm slowing you down with all these questions.
No, you're not. You're not.
But these are just questions that I've lived for 36 years with, and I've never had anyone answer. And I can imagine that there are other individuals out there who are intrigued.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm hopefully I'm giving you the right answers. I'm giving you the answers that I know, so hopefully they're pretty accurate.
Well, that's that's the great thing. People can let us know if we get it wrong, and
let's put it this way: it was Saul wanted. It was becoming out of control to the point that Saul got permission to go capture Jewish Christians from Antioch and other places and bring them back to Jerusalem. So it wasn't just a few here and there. It became something that the Jews became very concerned about at that time. It was beginning to get out of control a little bit. So they wanted to put it back into control.
That's such a fascinating, it's such a fascinating period in history to me, and hopefully we'll study it more in depth one day. And I know we have other things to address, but how these emerging identities clash with one another because obviously the first Christians, many of them came from a Jewish racial descent, and then they embraced this new identity by being born again.
Yeah.
And then they're at odds with cousins and brothers. It seems like. Seems like a little bit of a civil war, and then trying to separate who's a Christian from who's a Jew challenges a lot of our modern day categorization of these things.
Oh yeah, it wasn't a neat, when we read it, we try to read into it. It wasn't a nice, neat society back then that was broken down into nice, bright margins of people. It was, in places, it was just confusion, like a madhouse. Lots of stuff was going on. Who's who? Who's a Christian? Who's a Jew? What kind of a Jew are you? Are you a Hellenistic Jew? Were you a Greek? Do you speak Hebrew? Where do you fit into the Jewish religion? Are you a Christian? Christians were originally a segment of the Jewish faith. They were considered the synagogue until it got a little out of control. But for those people, and maybe for yourself, there is a book of Acts, which will be is an excellent opportunity to begin the study of the history of that time, because it's written in the history of that time.
Did Paul write that?
The book of Acts. I'm trying to think. Do we even know who wrote that? I'm sorry. That was Luke. Luke wrote the book of Acts because it's an extension of his gospel. Yeah. So it was written by Luke, who was an intellectual of his time. He was a doctor, so he was a pretty smart guy. Okay, I guess back.
Cool dude.
Now we have my topic here is no advantage. So there's under no advantage. Let's see what we have here. Climacus tells us that the contemporary has no advantage over the non-contemporary. He's not really a contemporary because of his immediate relationship with the teacher, which is one of sensual contemporaneity. I wasn't sure I'd be able to say that word. I did good. I did good there. What then does it mean to be a contemporary? So we've been talking about the contemporary all along, right? The contemporary of the teacher or of Christ. But we've never defined it. So here he's going to try to tackle that. So what does it mean to be a contemporary? Does it mean to eat and drink with Christ? To eat and drink with, to go out with him, to spend time with him? No, that's not really what a contemporary is, he says. Isn't it true that in another life, God will speak to some of those contemporaries, telling them that he didn't know them? And here Kierkegaard is referring to the scripture in Matthew, among other places, in chapter 7, verse 22 and 23. He says, "Many in that day will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonderful things in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.'" So that's kind of the scripture I think that Kierkegaard was alluding to there, that there were people who did eat and drink with Christ and spend time with him and thought that they were okay because they cast out demons in his name and did all these things. But Christ says to him, "No, you're not my really contemporary." He says, "Because you didn't you practice lawlessness. You didn't practice what you were supposed to. So you're not a contemporary." And many contemporaries, we have to remember, didn't believe in the teacher. And some said that he claimed he was the king of demons, of Beelzebub. It's only the believer who really knows the teacher because he receives the condition to know him in a very special way. It's not walking with him physically, but spiritually, in other words, to receive the condition of faith. And so faith has its own way of unfolding itself in our lives, influencing our lives, to let us know we have it and to let others know that we have it. No one knows the teacher. Now he makes this statement, no one knows the teacher unless he is known by him. So in my notes, I say, okay, what does that mean? Right? Okay, so sometimes I try to be a member of the audience and say, if I heard that for the first time, right, would that make sense to me? No, it wouldn't. So let me repeat it again. No one can know the teacher unless he's known by him. This is because the teacher must provide the learner with the condition. Okay. It's in this case, this is the presence of the teacher as the God-man. And later, this will fit the idea that God does all this out of love for us in the way he initiates faith by first loving us. So we have faith in God, not just because he's God, but because we discover that he loves us. And it's this God we have faith in. And I got an excerpt from 1 John chapter 4, verse 19, which may be where Kierkegaard is deriving this, where he says, we love him because he first loved us. So we don't just love God out of the blue. We don't just believe in God because somebody says, hey, I have a God. Do you want to believe in him? Oh, sure. I'll believe in him. No, it's I believe in him because he loves me. That's why I believe in him. So my faith is a response to God, which is what I've tried to say all along. We don't initiate faith. We can struggle and we can try to be faithful, but we can't do it. Our faith is a response to God's love. If it isn't a response to his love, then it's an artificial faith. So every person must receive the condition himself. It can't be received through anyone else because this isn't just a teaching, but the teacher himself who is the understanding, the condition, the love of God. God loves us through the teacher and not through the teaching. See, if Jesus were just a teacher and he gave us these beautiful teachings, it still wouldn't really necessarily be this great act of love. But what if the teacher himself did something that was so preposterous to show God's love? What if he gave his life? As Kierkegaard would say, it's such an ignominious manner, in such a terrible, horrible way, as an act of love. Then our faith would be a reaction to the teacher, to what he did, not just what he said, but to who he was and to what he did. So that's true faith. That's what our goal is, to try to grasp that. So the value, my kind of summary here is the value of the historical contemporary is that he had a limited historical knowledge. He did know certain things about the geographical area. We talk about the Bible. I've never been to Jerusalem or Israel, so I have to just look at pictures. So yeah, the disciples have an advantage over me geographically and historically. I wasn't raised in that time, so I don't know all that stuff. B, learning his teachings is deep and deepening our self-knowledge in the Socratic sense. So yeah, the disciple back then could kneel at the feet of Jesus and hear Jesus tell these things and might understand some of the teachings as far as like the parables. I mean, we may still not even today grasp some of the parables in the way they were meant to be grasped because we simply weren't raised in that culture. So yeah, they have an advantage with the parables too. But C, he says he could come to realize that he was in error and received the condition and becomes faithful. But in this sense, all of us have that same opportunity to share in this experience. So A and B, yes, but C, no, it's not an advantage. He doesn't have the advantage to receive the condition. No more so than we do, because the condition comes from that act of God's love. Okay. There is only one sense in which the contemporary might be more fortunate than a future generation. He might get greater clarity of the historical event and even the teaching itself in a limited point. But it does seem that many of those who heard the teachings directly, even directly, were more confused than clarified. So when we really come down to it, look at Peter. He was there sitting at his feet, listening to Jesus. And when Jesus says, well, I have to go, and now they're going to take me away and I have to die. And what's the first thing that comes out of Peter's mouth? Not, well, yeah, I'm glad now you're going to die because I've learned everything you wanted to teach me and we're all going to be blessed by this. No, it's, no, we can't let this happen to you. And Jesus responds to him, get behind me, Satan, because you're standing in the way of God. You know, this is God's will to be accomplished. So they, even with all those advantages, they didn't get it. So it kind of reflects back on that answer you had, the question you had earlier. No, they didn't get it until Christ, the resurrection, until they received the condition. So many contemporary Jews were distracted by their historical proximity with Christ. In other words, even the Jews of his time were distracted because they believed him to be the one, the Messiah would come and destroy the Romans, and he didn't. So in that case, being a contemporary of Christ hindered their faith because they had different expectations. So that kind of covers the rest of, what was it, section 4, the main part of section 4. The next part will be the interlude. But I don't think we want to tackle that now. What do you think?
I'm thinking, if you have the time, that we should meet twice this week. And that we should, if you have the time.
I do. I can make time.
I would say on Thursday or Friday. And I think we should bring this installment to a close, and we should try to cover the interlude and everything that I prepared for it next time, and rather than try to get into it today. How do you feel about that?
I think that's great because I think everybody's probably in overload right now, and I think they need time to digest some of the deep subjects, and we did really touch upon some really deep ideas and thoughts that I think people need to digest a little bit.
Well, the great thing about having this on the Noetic app is that they can do that, and they can come back to our lecture series, and they can, perhaps this is something that they'll listen over the course of 6 months, or
that's true,
6 days or something like that. We don't have to make it all happen at once. But I mean, you know, this was a lesson filled with so much. I know I kind of hold us back with all my questions, but I think you're giving us theological insights that I don't know if we could have unless we went to seminary or something like that. And that's, I guess, selfishly, I always wanted to go to seminary, but I couldn't do all the school.
Can't do everything.
Yeah, at some point I had to restrain myself and develop a specialty in something. So.
Well, there's also one thing about Noetic I want to point out too. An advantage is in studying in college. One of the things, especially in mathematics, one of the things the teacher would tell us that, okay, if you're, well, even in Greek, I remember it too. If you don't understand this chapter, go back to the earlier chapter and reread it. And you have that advantage. We're not live here, so if you didn't get today, go back to last week's and listen to last week's again.
Totally.
And then that'll just keep building and building and building till you're on Noetic like us.
Yeah, I would imagine. I would imagine that this would be the sort of lecture series that I would have to listen to over and over again. So
I hope they do. Yeah.
All right, Bob, I got to sign off. I've got to prepare the Jane Eyre seminar, which you can also find on the Noetic app and website. But I just want to thank Bob for being our discussion leader today, and I'll hopefully be a little bit more vocal later in the week. All right. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.